Hey kids, it's Miss Amber. So today we are going to read a story, the story of Ruby Bridges. She was the first African American child at all, to go to a fully white school. Schools used to be segregated. That means white students went to schools of their own and African American students went to schools of their own. Thankfully, that is not the case anymore. But since we are learning about Black History Month and we are learning about important people in Black history, I thought I would read this book that I brought home. So this is a story of Ruby Bridges. Our Ruby taught us all a lot. She became someone who helped change our country. She was part of history, just like the generals and the presidents are part of history. Their leaders, and so was Ruby. She led us away from hate and she led us nearer to knowing each other, the white folks and the black folks. Ruby's mother. There's a picture of Ruby. Ruby Bridges was born in a small cabin near Tylerton, Mississippi. We were very poor, very, very poor, Ruby said. My daddy worked picking crops. We just barely got by. There were times when we didn't have much to eat. The people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick the crops, so my daddy lost his job. And that's when we had to move. I remember us leaving. I was 4, I think. In 1957, the family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor. Her mother took care of the children during the day, and after they were tucked into bed, Ruby's mother went to work scrubbing floors in a bank. Every Sunday, the family went to church. We wanted our children to be near God's Spirit, Ruby's mother said. We wanted them to start feeling close to Him from the very start. At that time, black children and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans. The black children were not able to receive the same education as white children. It wasn't fair, and it was against the nation's law. In 1960, a judge ordered 4 black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls went to McDon 19. 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to first grade in William Frantz Elementary School. Ruby's parents were very proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in this important event in America's history. They went to church. We sat there and we prayed to God, Ruby's mother said, that we'd all be strong and we'd have the courage and we'd get through any trouble, and Ruby would be a good girl and she'd hold her head up high and be a credit to her own people and a credit to all the American people. We prayed long and we prayed hard. On Ruby's first day, a large crowd of angry white people gathered around outside the Frantz Elementary School. The people carried signs that said they didn't want black children in a white school. People called Ruby names and some wanted to hurt her. The city and the state police did not help Ruby. The President of the United States ordered federal marshals to walk with Ruby into the school buildings. The marshal carried guns. Every day for weeks that turned into months, Ruby experienced that kind of school day. She walked to Frantz School surrounded by marshals, wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair and carrying her lunch pail. Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks. As Ruby approached the school, she saw a crowd and people marching up and down the street. Men and women and children shouted at her. They pushed her towards the marshals, and the marshals kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd and not say a word. And there she is walking with the marshals. The white people in the neighborhood would not send their children to school. When Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone except for her teacher, Miss Hurley. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with or learn with, to eat with lunch with. But every day Ruby went into the classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to business of learning. She was polite and she worked well at her desk, Miss Hurley said. She enjoyed her time there. She didn't seem nervous or anxious or irritable or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child I've ever taught. So Ruby began to learn how to read and write in an empty classroom, an empty building. And there she is at her desk. "Sometimes I'd look at her and wonder how she did it," said Miss Hurley. "How she went by those mobs and sat there all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable." Miss Hurley would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed so calm and confident, or Ruby kept saying that she was doing fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep on being so relaxed and hopeful, or if she'd gradually begin to wear down, or even decide that she no longer wanted to go to school. Then one morning something happened. Miss Hurley stood by a window in her classroom as she usually did, watching Ruby walk towards the school. Suddenly Ruby stopped, right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She stood there facing all of those men and women, and she seemed to be talking to them. There's her teacher looking out the window. Miss Hurley saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what Ruby could be saying. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. The marshals were frightened, and they tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. Then Ruby stopped talking, and she walked into the school. When she went into the classroom, Miss Hurley asked her what had happened. Miss Hurley told Ruby that she'd been watching and that she was surprised when Ruby stopped and talked to the people in the mob. Ruby became irritated. "I didn't stop and talk with them," she said. "Ruby, I saw you talking," Miss Hurley said. "I saw your lips moving." "I wasn't talking," said Ruby. "I was praying, and I was praying for them." Every morning Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from the school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning she forgot until she was already in the middle of the angry mob. When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried through the mob as usual. As she walked down the few blocks and the crowd was behind her, Ruby said a prayer she repeated twice a day, before and after school. "Please, God, try to forgive those people, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they are doing. So you can forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you." And there's Ruby. And then this is afterward. This is what happened after the story. Later that year, 2 white boys joined Ruby at the France Elementary School. Their parents were tired of seeing the boys get into mischief around the house when they could have been in school learning. The mob became very angry when the first white boys went back to school, but those boys were soon joined by other children. "We'd been sitting back and letting our children get cheated out of an education because some people have tried to take the law into their own hands," one parent said. "It's time for us to fight for the side of the law and for our children's right to go to school and to get an education." They all did get their education. Ruby and a growing number of boys and girls went to school with her. By the time Ruby was in the 2nd grade, the mobs had given up their struggle to scare Ruby and defeat their federal judge's order that New Orleans schools must desegregate so that children of all races might be in the same classroom. Year after year, Ruby went to France school. She graduated from it and then went on to graduate from high school. Ruby Bridges is married to a building contractor and has 4 sons who attend school within the New Orleans public school systems. Now a successful businesswoman, she has created the Ruby Bridges Educational Foundation for the purposes of increasing parental involvement in the schools. For further information about the foundation, write to the following address. About the author. Dr. Robert Coles is a child psychologist who worked with young people in various parts of America. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and received his degree from Harvard University. And he did a lot of research for this book. And then the illustrator is George Ford, and he drew the pictures and colored the pictures for this book as well as many others. And there we have Ruby walking to school. As the first black child to attend an all-white elementary school, Ruby Bridges showed us all how we can be brave and forgiving to a 6-year-old child, as a 6-year-old child can be. And that is the end.